everybody, welcome to String and Story. My name is HollyAnne Knight, and it's my job to guide you to quilt and to live with confidence. Welcome to our Monday evening session as we are talking about quilting plans this evening. This is part of our run-up to the reopening of Free Motion Quilting Academy, and I want to make sure that before we head into Free Motion Quilting Academy that you have all the tools you need to succeed in this class. I'm so excited to talk about quilting plans tonight because I know it's something that a lot of you have questions about. Now, if you will forgive me for just a second, I'm going to hit refresh like 37 times because I want to make sure I find this video. I want to make sure I haven't chopped my own head off with the camera. I'm doing a little bit of a different camera angle tonight. It is close. Okay. Let me tilt this camera up just a hair and a half so it doesn't make me nuts the whole time that I'm peeking at it. Yes, my iron is on in the background. Fear not. I will be returning to it after our time together. Yay! Oh my gosh. Okay, Sue. Full disclosure, of all the quilts that I've designed, Perfect Fit and Serious are the two that I had the hardest time quilting. Just for what that's worth. I don't know if that's comforting, but I know what you mean with that one. And I have some thoughts that I will share. So remind me to circle back. Hey Terry, hey Jan, hey Cheryl, hey Lori, Becky, Gina. Oh, I'm so glad you guys are here. All right. I'm going to jump straight in. I've got a couple of links for you guys. I actually have 2 blog posts because I have a lot to say about quilting plans. It's something that I'm planning a lot of content around for Free Motion Quilting Academy, but I want to make sure that kind of the basics are covered before we head into this course, okay? So for those of you who are not familiar, Free Motion Quilting Academy is my big online course. We cover several dozen free motion quilting motifs. We talk more in depth about making quilting plans. We practice our first whole cloth quilt, and it's a course that's designed to take you from being a beginner and perhaps hesitant beginner free motion quilter to a confident intermediate quilter in about 8 weeks, okay? This course will be reopening mid-September, and the final link in the caption of this video is actually the waiting list for this course. So if something I just said, you're like, that's exactly what I've been looking for, go get your name on that list, okay? For the rest of y'all, and for all y'all, really, let me make sure that you see these other 2 links. So the first blog I called Introduction to Quilting Plans, and it basically talks about what is a quilting plan and why is it important. And kind of some things to keep in mind as you're making your quilting plan. I'm going to talk through those things in just a hot second. I just want you to know what's in that post generally. The other blog post is how to make a quilting plan, and it talks through a little bit more specific kind of the step-by-step funnel that you can follow as you're working on your quilting plan, okay? I'm going to talk through both of these in brief tonight. As I mentioned, they're spelled out a little bit more extensively with some images and all of that inside the blog post, but I know that sometimes hearing things explained is more helpful. Now, my biggest goal tonight is, especially if you've had a chance to read those posts already, or if you just have a burning question that you don't know if the post answers it or not, but it's just burning inside you, I want to make sure I get your questions answered tonight, okay? So if you have big questions around quilting plans, like Sue, your question of like, what about Perfect Fit, right? That's a great question. Or any other questions related to this topic, please go ahead and start putting them in the comments, and at the end, I'm going to scroll through and make sure that I hit those, okay? All right. Ooh, hello, Joe. Sneaky, sneaky. Oh, another quick side note. For those of you who have been participating in the Star Island Quilt Along and you purchased one of the bundles that comes with a label, they are in the envelopes. They will be going to the post office hopefully tomorrow, possibly Wednesday. So be looking for those in the next few days if you're here in the U.S. Those of you who are overseas, I don't know exactly how long it'll take to get to Canada, the UK, and Australia. I think those are the 3 out of the U.S. countries that labels are heading to, but do know they're on their way, okay? All right. Things you should know about quilting plans. Let's start at the very beginning. What is a quilting plan? A quilting plan might look something like this, or it might look something like this. I'm sitting, by the way, at this angle so that I can hold things up and you have a fighting chance of being able to kind of sort of see it. A quilting plan is essentially a drawing that you do of your quilt, of what you're planning to quilt on your quilt before you actually start quilting it, all right? Full disclosure, this is very important, and I need you to believe me on this. This is the actual hardest part of quilting your own quilts. Okay, I mean that with all seriousness and no tongue-in-cheek whatsoever. Okay, the mechanics of learning how to quilt the motifs, I think that's the part that often feels more scary. All that takes is practice. That's just mechanics. Okay, I'm gonna assume that 99+% of you who are watching this are literate, Thus, if you learn to read and to write, you can learn the mechanics of free motion quilting, okay? You also can learn to make a quilting plan, but I think this is actually the harder thing, believe it or not, okay? That's part of why I have 2 blog posts for you tonight, and it's something that will be talked about in the course that opens next month, okay? Why is making a quilting plan the hardest part? It's because it's all the decisions. Decisions are exhausting. I'm sure you've heard of decision fatigue, right? I, as a mom and a business owner, decision fatigue is like the definition of my life, right? Because everything I do all day long, can my child do or have this? Do I need to do this? Where do we need to go? Does everyone have their shoes? What shoes are we wearing? What pants? Am I wearing my hair down or up? All these decisions we make all day long. You have your own set of decisions that you make all day long. Everything from like, do I want like coffee or tea with my breakfast, to do I want to eat breakfast now or later, to am I going to go out for breakfast or eat breakfast in, right? Whatever set of decisions you make every day, decisions are one of the most difficult things that we do in our lives. And there's something that's very mentally taxing, right? And each of us has kind of a threshold point at which we are done and we can make no more decisions. And if you're like me, you get kind of grumpy when you get to that point, right? Like I was kind of at that point by the time Hubster got home from work today, right? And the kids kept asking things and I like literally kind of threw up my hands and was like, I cannot. And it's not that they were doing anything wrong or that they were being frustrating. It's that I was done making decisions, right? Like I could no longer choose between this thing or that thing. And I had to come upstairs and do some things that didn't require decisions for a little while, right? So that's why making a quilting plan is the hard part, because you're making a decision. You're making a commitment. Now, what is beautiful about a quilting plan is that it is the hardest part whether you make those decisions on paper or whether you make those decisions on the fly while you're working on your quilt. But paper is a lot more forgiving, okay? Especially if you purchase patterns through me, and I know many other designers do this as well. I put coloring sheets in my patterns. So if you draw out a quilting plan and decide you don't like it, you don't even have to erase it. You can just print another page. Right, now notice I'm using those coloring pages not as coloring pages. Well, this one I started to color and then realized I didn't want to. But I'm using these coloring pages, right, as a place to draw out my motifs. I can see my piecing, all right? So a quilting plan is crucial because it allows you to get the hardest thing done before you start actually quilting your quilt, okay? And then that way a quilting plan sets you free. Because while it takes the mental energy, and I usually, just so you know, it is exceptionally rare that I do a quilting plan and start quilting on the same day. Because this takes my brain, right? I sat down last night to try to draw some potential quilting plans for Star Island, and it was quite late, and I literally looked at the sheet of paper and went, nope, because there were no more decision-making muscles left, right? This is something I had to work on like first thing this morning. Okay, so that's the basics of what a quilting plan is. You're making yourself a roadmap. So then by the time you sit down to quilt, then the quilting itself gets to be really enjoyable, right? There's 3 reasons. There's 3 reasons free motion quilting can be stressful, okay? One is that just your machine is acting up and there's just issues, right? This is what happened with the Patronus quilt recently for me. Like the tension went off and it was super duper frustrating, right? And so mechanical, like machine mechanical issues can cause free motion quilting to be frustrating. Free motion quilting can also be frustrating if your mechanics are unpracticed, right? So if you're brand new and you have not done a lot of practice on whatever motif you're trying to do on your quilt, or if you're doing your practice and it's with a brand new motif, or even just you're like, this is literally the first thing I've ever done that's related to free motion quilting, right? So the machine's mechanics, your mechanics, those are the 2 big reasons why free motion quilting can feel overwhelming and stressful. The third reason is if you're trying to make decisions on the fly, right? And you don't know where you need to go next. You're not sure what motif you're going to use. You don't have it mapped out. And so not only are you trying to coordinate the mechanics of a machine with the mechanics of your body, you're also trying to think, right? The mechanics of the machine, as a general rule, you can keep your machine cleaned and oiled and all of the things and eliminate this as a frustration point. 9 times out of 10, right? Things can always go wrong because machines. But as a general rule, you can eliminate that with a bit of practice of learning how your machine works. Your physical mechanics, you can largely eliminate the issue there through practice. And it's muscle memory, just like writing your name is muscle memory after a while, right? Which, Gina, girlfriend, I have had students that start Free Motion Quilting Academy that they're like, HollyAnne, I can't draw. and I see their doodles and I'm like, you do struggle with drawing, I'll grant you that, and they're now quilting stunningly beautiful things, okay? Because drawing is practice, right? And honestly, like if you look at some of my doodles, now these are okay-ish. Honestly, most of my like drawings of quilting plans and of quilting motifs, like they're nothing to write home about, right? I think that drawing them sometimes is harder than actually quilting them once you get in the groove of things, but it uses the same set of muscle memory, right? Just like writing. So you had to learn to write and you'll learn to draw quilting motifs. It's the same thing. I promise you've got this, okay? It's not about whether or not you consider yourself an artist, okay? That is why I'm here, right? Is to guide you through this process, just like someone is guided the right verb there? Yes. Just like someone guided you through the process of learning to write, okay? So how do we make this easier? There's a couple of ways. One is simply knowing what you're getting yourself into. Practice makes a lot of progress with this as well. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what quilting plans are, why they're important. A few things to keep in mind when you're making a quilting plan before I jump into what you're gonna do to make your quilting plan and then take some of these questions, okay? And I'm gonna go ahead and just acknowledge that like, I wanna answer all the big picture questions here tonight. Are you gonna leave this evening feeling like a 100% expert in quilting plans? Probably not, because there's a lot more I could say, right? That's why I've had a whole class on the topic and why that class has become part of Free Motion Quilting Academy, right? There's a lot to say, but I'm gonna make sure you have the big picture and that you see how important this is and get the basic structure around it, okay? Other things you need to keep in mind. You're gonna keep in mind, where is this quilt headed, right? A quilt that is headed for a cat bed or a dog bed is different than a quilt that's headed to be used by a kid, which is different than a quilt that's going to be on your bed, which is different than a quilt that is going to be gifted, which is different than a quilt that's going to be submitted to a show. All right, do you see the progression I just made there? Like, if your pet is going to sleep on it, any number of things can go wrong and it is still a beautifully acceptable quilt, right? If a kid is going to sleep on it, and especially a young child that is likely to like throw up on it, right? There's still lots of grace, right? The closer we get to that like show level thing, the more precision that's involved. Note my choice of word there. I'm not saying perfection, right? I don't actually think it's super healthy to strive for perfection as a quilter. Precision, excellence, constant improvement, absolutely, right? Perfection just stresses everybody out, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and take that off the table, that's not my goal here, right? Even in quilts that I work on that, you know, I've got quilts sitting that are ready to be submitted to QuiltCon for this year, right? They are not perfect. I'm going to go ahead and just tell you that right now, because that's not what I'm aiming for, right? And will I look back 10 years from now and be like, wow, I could have done that so much better? Maybe, but that's what progress is all about, right? I care much more about general excellence and progress than perfection any day of the week, okay? All right, other things that you might want to think about. Just simply the level of time you wanted to put into something. Chances are you're not going to put a super complicated quilting plan together for a quilt your dog is going to sleep on, right? Now, the exception to that might be if you really love your dog, you might. It might also be if you're wanting the practice, right? You're like, I want to practice in what feels like a very safe, low-pressure environment. Then you might absolutely put a lot of time and thought and love into that, right? And so on. You see what I mean? So keeping these things in mind, the purpose of the quilt, how much you're really wanting to put into the quilt, what is the final product supposed to be? Is it supposed to be something that like hangs on the wall and is like, oh, or is it supposed to be like the quilt you take on a family picnic, right? Weigh all these things in as you're making your quilting plan, because you may not want to do something like this, or honestly, even something like one of these ideas that I've started sketching out on something that is, you know, for the dog or for the family picnic. You might, I've been known to, but that's a, you know, it's a personal preference, things to keep in mind. Okay, let me pause real quick. Hello, Kate. Jan, I love you owning that, though I have my doubts about you being a horrible artist, because it sounds like you're a great quilt artist. Just maybe you haven't spent a lot of time painting, so it's not your thing, right? Okay. Hello, Anita. Okay, I'm going to scan back through these in a hot second. I want to go ahead and jump real quick through the steps of making a quilting plan, and then I'm going to dive into questions, all right? Now, there are a number of lists in this second blog post for you because I'm a list person. That's how my brain works. What you're going to notice is I kind of get more specific every time. I start with the general process of quilting a quilt. Please note that I expect you to celebrate and enjoy your finished quilt top. I think that's huge. Just getting a quilt to the top stage is huge, and we often gloss over that because we're like, oh, I have all these tops sitting around. I need to just finish things, and you guys know I love finishing things. But I also believe in celebration, especially if it's a quilt you've been working on for a while. It's a quilt that taught you something. It's a quilt you're particularly in love with. And all of it's worth celebrating. So pause at that stage and celebrate. Please also note that I don't have you just jump from making a quilting plan into the quilting. Note that step of self-talk in the middle, right? This is part of where I mentioned that I don't often make my quilting plan and actually start quilting on the same day. Once in a while it happens if I'm feeling very inspired about something, I'm very certain of what I quilt, and there's nothing that's really gonna throw me for a loop in the middle of it, right? Quilting plans that really are gonna stretch me or grow me, Kate Brendan, I know you're on here, the Patronus quilt is one of these, right? We know how long that marinated. The time between when I had a pretty good concept of what was going on this quilt and the execution beginning to happen was very long, as that just like had to marinate and come to the surface and be ready. It was a long period of self-talk, right? And that's okay, right? Especially as you're learning, as you're working on, maybe you move on from some of these things that you're not super emotionally attached to, and so you're practicing your free motion quilting on them and it feels pretty easy, but that first time that you've got maybe your first Bonnie Hunter quilt under your needle and it's something you've already invested hundreds of hours in, it's okay if you have to take a breather there and be really ready for it, all right? And in the quilting, which you've got. And if you don't know how to do it yet, you're going to by the end of Free Motion Quilting Academy, because that's my job, is to guide you through that, right? Now, the making of the quilting plan, this important step 3 in actually quilting a quilt, I think so much hinges on this step because I think it's the hardest part. I really do. Which, again, please note, it's the hardest part with a very forgiving medium, okay? The first thing I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you to make 3 decisions as you're making a quilting plan, okay? The first is I need you to decide whether you're going to adhere to the seam lines or disregard them, or some mix of both, right? That happens sometimes where I like abide by some seam lines and ignore others. Right now, let me give you an example of where this could happen. I should have grabbed this off the wall before I started talking. But for example, it's my Star Island quilt, right? Y'all have seen the purple and pink one. I don't actually have that quilting plan in front of me, but it's the one I did the big scallops on. There's a picture of it inside the blog post that I'm talking about. That is a quilting plan where I completely disregarded my seam lines, right? I just quilted over those suckers like they weren't even there. I quilted that thing like it was a whole cloth. Okay, that's not entirely true. I mostly did. This one I really and truly did. I treated this like a whole cloth quilt, this Lanterns of Hope quilting plan. The only thing I used my Star Island piecing for, with the one with the big scallops, is I paid attention to where the seams between the blocks were, because that's how I aligned the half circles that became those scallops and offset them from one another. So only where the blocks were coming together were there points that I used for reference in order to line up those scallops across the quilt, right? Everything else, I completely disregarded seam lines. Now, these plans here, you'll notice, are largely adhering to the seam lines. Or if you look at the Lanterns of Hope quilt pattern that's in the blog post, when we did the Lanterns of Hope quilt along last summer, and then we talked through the 10 basic free motion quilting motifs as part of the end of our quilt along, and I provided a quilting plan that I was following where I chose a different motif for each color on the quilt, and those motifs were contained by the seam lines, right? Now these motifs though, these quilting plans, they will be a bit of a mix because I will abide by the seam lines within the main portion of the block. But if you look closely, and there's a picture of it in the blog post, I know I'm not holding it up for super long. It doesn't make for a pretty camera shot, right? But I will disregard these seam lines here, right, where the blues meet each other, and I will largely be treating the blue areas as a whole section on most of these that I'm doodling out right now. So that's a mix of which seam lines I'm abiding by and which ones I'm not. So that's the first decision I need you to make, okay? Let me jump and make sure I didn't miss any big questions around that. Hey, Carol! Kate, this quilt, man, Patronus is just proving to be, it's a labor of love. I like the way you put that earlier. I think that's just the best way. Hey guys. Okay, perfect. Wanted to make sure that no one was like panicking over anything. All right, decision number 2. What part of the top do you want to emphasize? Now, in general, most of the quilts I quilt, there is some emphasis point, all right? In the Star Island quilt with the big scallops, I actually emphasized that scallop shape, right? Go look at the close-up in this blog post. You will see I did a double band of quilting on those scallops so that there's an arc that's unquilted. Everything else is quilted very densely, but I made sure that scallop shape really stood out. So I actually wasn't emphasizing a piece of the quilting. It was a shape that occurred in some of the fabric that I used, and then I repeated it in the quilting, right? And that was my emphasis point. For the Lanterns of Hope, this quilt pattern, the emphasis is mostly on kind of these shapes that are existing, right? Again, not an emphasis on the piecing itself. With Star Island, I have 3 quilt patterns here that are quilting plans. 1, 2, 3. Here, I've emphasized the star. Notice it's the thing that's most minimally quilted. Here, I'm actually emphasizing the lantern shape, so this would be the turquoise. Okay, so you can see the star. The first plan that I sketched out emphasizes the star. The second plan emphasizes the turquoise shapes, that lantern kind of shape that occurs around the block. And then this final quilting plan down at the bottom, notice where the feathers are, right? That quilting plan, because none of this is super exciting and it's all very densely quilted, but I'm leaving unquilted. Again, it's that lantern shape, but it's drawing the eye towards feathers that could occur in the sashings, right? So deciding how you're quilting something will draw the eye to different sections of the quilt. And so pick your favorite part. It could be the obvious thing to emphasize, like the star, right? It could be the section of the quilt that you made with your very favorite fabric, right? Let's say that I was like exceptionally attached to these turquoise fabrics. It could be that part, right? I mean, if I was really exceptionally attached to this like background cream, it could be that part, right? But choose what you want to emphasize. And particularly if you are abiding by the seam lines, plan to leave that part either unquilted or very sparsely quilted, right? If it's a larger area, you're going to need to do some quilting on it, probably. If it's a smaller area, then you might just stitch in the ditch around it so it really pops, okay? And then use a denser motif around those areas so that that pop kind of gets maximum visual impact. All right, your final step, okay? Now, this final step is the one that I get the most questions about, but I think it starts to fall into place if you've made the first 2 decisions, okay? The final step is what motifs are you actually going to use, right? And that's something that feels very scary, particularly if you're new to free motion quilting. You don't know a lot of motifs yet. You're like, I can kind of meander, like what are my other options? And this is why I have begun teaching more about quilting plans inside Free Motion Quilting Academy as you're learning all of these motifs. Because as you're learning the motifs, you'll start to see how some motifs lend themselves well to certain shapes. And you'll start to learn that kind of language. So when we're discussing, do you have to be an artist in order to make a quilting plan or in order to successfully free motion quilt? No, because you'll begin to see patterns. And a lot of what happens in free motion quilting is patterns, just like with piecing, right? If you've been quilting for any length of time, you begin to see patterns of different types of units that go well together, right? Things that fit in and make sense, right? We know that shapes that tend to have kind of 2 triangles on the side tend to show up as star points, right? That's going to be Tri-Rex units and flying geese, right? And so when you start to see those shapes, you start to think, oh, this is probably going to come together into some sort of star. Not always, but often, right? Half square triangles play well with each other. We know we tend to get high points of contrast with half square triangles, where one side will be a lot lighter than the other. And these are all patterns that we begin to recognize in piecing, but what we may not realize is that free motion quilting abides by kind of patterns as well, right? Feathers lend themselves really well to borders. Things like a telephone cord or a loopy meander, right? This kind of loop, loop, loop. That lends itself really well to triangles. Other things that lend themselves well to triangles are things like wishbones, right? And all of these patterns begin to take shape and you become more familiar with them with practice, okay? What else do I want to say about that? That's the big thing. The final thing there then is I also mentioned some contrasts that you might think about as you're making a quilting plan between curvy motifs, think like feathers, and more geometric motifs, something like a square spiral, right? So like a motif that's more feminine versus a motif that feels more masculine, right? And putting those things next to each other can create some really visually interesting juxtapositions. Also, the juxtaposition we already talked about of leaving an area much less quilted than another area, right? And you get a different depth that happens there, all right? This is a flyby. I recognize that. I'm going to jump over and answer some questions, but the big picture here is taking the time to make a quilting plan significantly reduces your stress once you actually have your beautiful quilt under the needle because you've made yourself a map, right? Making the map is a bit of a challenge, but it gets easier with practice. And in the process of making that map, you're going to make decisions about what you want to emphasize and how you want to emphasize it, okay? Ruth, are they looking in the Quilting Rockstars group? They might be. I will share this to Quilting Rockstars when we're done here. Let me make sure that there are not any burning questions. If one of y'all wants to share it to Quilting Rockstars while I'm talking, actually, that would be super, super helpful. Okay. Sue, where did your question go? Okay, perfect fit. Thoughts about perfect fit, Sue. And guys, if you have questions from everything that I have just like flown through for you, this is the like 10,000 foot view, riding by on a horse, whatever you want to call it. Like I said, all of this is spelled out a lot more in these blog posts and will continue to be discussed as part of the class. I just want to begin giving you a framework around quilting plans because I often am like, and then I made a quilting plan, and then I just keep going, right? And I understand that it's very easy to be, wait, what is a quilting plan? Like, what the, right? Okay, perfect fit. Perfect fit is visually in the same family and also in terms of like the block it was originally derived from, the log cabin, in the same family as Lanterns of Hope, right? So I think if you take a peek at the Lanterns of Hope quilting plan that's in that second blog post, Sue, you might find that inspirational. It would lend itself well to having a few different motifs and following the color lines, right? Particularly if there's one that you really like wanted to emphasize and leave unquilted and maybe just do some stitch in the ditch, right? And then quilt the other two down. That could be very interesting. It also lends itself really well to an all over motif, right? And I don't say that super often, but part of the reason, I mean, technically any quilt can lend itself really well to an all over, okay? I tend to be like an all custom kind of person. Like that's so frequently my jam. But part of the reason I think perfect fit lends itself really well to an all over motif is because there's so much going on with the piecing. And when you look at it, like when you look at Lanterns of Hope, and I compare them to each other because they're both kind of log cabin based, right? But when you look at Lanterns of Hope, what your brain is primarily comprehending is this kind of color flow. You're not looking at the individual shapes of the piecing. When you look at Lanterns of Hope, you just see the color progression from one side of the quilt to the other. But when you're looking at perfect fit, the thing the brain is trying to figure out is how does that work, right? It's a bit of a mind bender, almost optical illusion kind of quilt. And so it lends itself well to either using quilting that continues to emphasize that piecing, or that it's kind of just, it's there, but you see past the quilting just to the piecing, right? So that your brain can be busy trying to figure out that pattern. Hopefully that helps. Let me see if you gave any. Oh, that's a very great question, Lisa. I will get there in a hot second. Okay. Quilting plan, constant pattern. Yes. So when I am working on something, if I am abiding by the seam lines, right, and I am working on a one block quilt, for example, Star Island is a one block quilt. You get a secondary design, but it's kind of an optical trick, right? Because we piece it as single blocks, okay? I will quilt them all the same, okay? And so what that means for the actual functional quilting of it is I either will figure out how to quilt a whole block, and I will start and stop within that block and have, you know, as many ends to bury as there are blocks in the quilt. Or I may actually figure out how to quilt one block and have it lead into the next block. I was able to do that with one of my quilting plans for the North Star quilt, that it went straight into the next block, which is very handy. But yes, it's repetitive, just like the piecing. If you're abiding by, now, if you are choosing to abide by the piecing and you don't want to quilt every block the same, that is 100% up to you. As a general rule, I do, and I think it's less overwhelming if you're just getting started, okay? If you are not abiding by the piecing, something like this craziness, then of course all of that goes out the window, and I mean, it's really just a free-for-all anyway, because we're having fun like that. Okay, let's see. Hard time looking at the quilt as a whole versus individual blocks. Okay, so Sue, here's a great thing for you. These quilting, these coloring sheets. Now, jumping down to Lisa's question that she mentions at the end, what do you do if your pattern doesn't have this? Graph paper, my dear. Let me think. Do I have any graph paper drawings handy? That would be very useful if I did. Let me see if I have one in here. Oh, I do in here for sure. Okay. Here's a great example. If I can find it. Y'all probably recognize this block if you're fans of Bonnie Hunter. So this is en Provence, right? And spoiler, Bonnie doesn't provide a coloring sheet for her mystery quilts because that's the whole point. So I just took graph paper, right? And I drew out the block. As a general rule, when I'm doing this, I will pick a ratio, right? So it might be 1 inch to a square on the graph paper. I use 1/4 inch graph paper. It might be 2 inches, might be 3 inches, whatever kind of makes sense to make a block or two fit on your page. It's a little more tedious to have to draw it out yourself, but it's worth it, frankly. I also find that drawing it out myself, particularly if I'm working on a pattern that I didn't design, which doesn't happen super often for me right now, but might be something that happens more often for you, is that drawing out the piecing on graph paper in order to make my quilting plan, something about it's a different level of understanding of the construction of the block. And sometimes I will see different shapes in the drawing process than I saw in the piecing process, right? And that will help me decide what I want to emphasize, right? Now, if you have something like this, and Sue, the reason I think that this may help you is because it's hard to see where the blocks end and begin when it's just black and white like this. And so, or a simple line drawing. And so you might, your eye might be drawn not to the star, but to the secondary design that occurs in Star Island, right? But having the color taken out of it can sometimes help with that. Also, the thing that I will do if I'm really having a hard time seeing past a certain part of the quilt is I'll put it up on my design wall. If you don't have a design wall, you could like lay it out on your bed or drape it over the back of the couch, somewhere where you're gonna walk by it a lot, and your peripheral vision as you're kind of coming to and fro will begin to pick up things about the quilt without you really realizing it, and it'll kind of get in your head. And this again, I use the term marinating or mulling over or chewing on, right? I will just kind of live with a quilt top for a little while if I need that kind of beneath the conscious level understanding to start to come, if that makes sense. Okay. It's kind of a mushy creative process. I don't have a list for you on that one other than I find that it helps, and it something about like not looking at it straight on helps me get past that. Yes, Lori, I'm so excited that you brought this up. This is my map, but you know how like when you're in your car and you're using a GPS to get somewhere, let's say you're going, like for me, maybe I'm going from my house to my mom's house, right? And okay, let's be honest, I don't do this. Hubster. When Hubster is driving from our house to my parents' house, he uses the GPS every time. I have feelings about this. Because why do I have feelings about this? Some of you are already guessing. If you've seen the movie RV, you know, right? Because sometimes the GPS doesn't know what the hey it's doing. Sometimes it really does, but sometimes it doesn't know about things like mall traffic or the train schedule, right? Like, oh, we're going to get stuck at the tracks, or we want to go this way because the boys want to see the train, right? And so there are times when you have a GPS, it's telling you where to go, and you completely ignore it, right? Tell me you've seen the movie RV, right? And they get in the RV, and he gets Lola all set, and they're off to Colorado, and she's, you know, Lola's like, please turn right, and the wife is like, don't turn right. And he's like, but Lola says mall traffic. And then, like, all hell breaks loose, right? Because he's trying to listen to the GPS and his wife is yelling at him, and he really should have ignored the GPS and listened to his wife, right? It's the same thing with your quilting plan. You put it on paper, okay, but it is not carved in stone. It's just written on paper. So it could be that you start quilting and realize, like, no, this actually isn't going to work the way I thought it does, and you either need to go back to the drawing board or you revise on the fly. Right? Sometimes that involves a little unpicking, sometimes it doesn't. Like, there's always a level of flexibility in this, but I find that to be a much less stressful process if I've already got kind of the general idea of where I'm headed. Okay? Let me make sure. I was writing something. Oh, that's awesome. Yes. Practice around writing. Absolutely. Yes, cursive. Okay, so cursive writing and free motion quilting are basically samesies, like truly. So, like, if you're my age, this might be bad news. But for maybe I learned cursive, so maybe if you're younger than me. But for most of us, right, we learned script writing, and that's the only way I write. Like, I don't print because it's faster and it's instinctual and it's muscle memory, and I don't even have to think about it. Right? Free motion quilting is the same way. Okay, it gets into you. Okay, so Terry, I think I already mentioned that. Okay, so Lisa, I said share how to create a coloring sheet. What could you do as an all-over for a baby boy? Ruth, that is a great question. Oh, and Kate, you know it better too. Okay, yeah, I get that. So my favorite all-over for boys quilts is a square spiral. So literally, it's like a spiral, except the square. Except, spoiler, I don't go back out. You know how on a spiral, you loop in, and then you loop back out, right? With a square spiral, I go in, and then I cut to wherever I'm going next. Like, I just zip right across it, okay? I wish I had my perfect fit handy. It's like all the way downstairs, so I'm not gonna run down and get it. But that's what I used on my perfect, well, it was actually Hubster's perfect fit. The big perfect fit that I made, it's my go-to for dudes. It works up quickly, because let's be honest, dudes are not really gonna care if you put a whole bunch of feathers on something, as a general rule. Some guys will, most guys won't. Right? So a square spiral, it works up quickly. It's a good all over. It's very forgiving, all the good things, right? Oh yes, good thread weight for piecing. I'm sorry whoever I just made angry with that, but I'm sorry. Yes, I highly recommend 50 weight for piecing. I second Kate's response on that. Yes, Laura, I love to use my coloring page for my quilting plan. So maybe I should start calling this the coloring and quilting plan page, now that I think about it. Happy birthday, Lydia. I see you're here. Yes, you also could take a picture and print out pictures. Absolutely. Love that plan. What size quilt should you be using for your final project for Free Motion Quilting Academy? So the whole cloth challenge is only a fat quarter, just for what that's worth. You're jumping ahead, Miss Bev. Always exciting. Yes. All right. Yes, and also if you don't, like, if taking a picture and then getting that on your computer and getting that to your printer, etc. If your quilt pattern is digital and there's any kind of like full front shot within the pattern, you could also just print that. Like, usually the cover is like a straight on shot of the quilt. You can also print that multiple times and draw on that, all right? Now, one other thing I do want to touch on real quick before I wrap up is sometimes people make reference to getting like a big piece of plexiglass and laying it over their quilt and using like a whiteboard marker or a vis-a-vis to practice their quilting plan. I'm not entirely against it, but let me tell you why I don't do it. There's two big reasons. One, I would be the person that ends up writing on my quilt. Like, that would happen 100% guaranteed. I know you can put the colored tape around the edges. I would still end up drawing on my quilt. Okay? And with that, especially if you use a whiteboard marker, it's just very easy for that to get erased and then you don't know what you did. Right? Actually, I have 3 reasons. Second reason is it's hard to make side-by-side comparisons, right? Unless you're going to have a whole bunch of these, like, clear things where you can draw multiple things and then look at them and pick your favorite. It's hard to know, what have I already tried, what have I played around with. Like, you notice I printed this one coloring sheet and I've got multiple versions of a quilting plan in progress on it that I'm playing around with, and I can see them right next to each other and see how they strike me. Okay? The third reason is once you pull that off your quilt and set it to one side, you don't have a good point of reference for, like, what things you drew go where on the quilt, right? And if it's fairly simple, then that might be just fine. A quilting plan like this one, like I did for En Provence, right? If I didn't have the reference of the block, it would be useless. Like, I would have no idea. And so then I'd be stuck constantly having to take that and lay it back over the quilt and figure out where I was, and, like, it would be very difficult, okay? So I like to have it on paper, then I can keep it sitting right next to me and I can make reference to it without having to really move around. If I'm on the long arm, I literally will lay it on the section of the quilt next to me, like right next to where I'm quilting, so I can see it at all times. I literally treat it like a map, okay? And sometimes I ignore the map and sometimes I change the map, but I always keep it handy, okay? Okay, I think those are my big thoughts on quilting plans. I have lots of thoughts about quilting plans, guys. I could go on and on. It's something I'm really passionate about because I think it makes a big difference in your free motion quilting journey. Making this part of your quilting habit. It's a great way to practice your motifs. I'm a firm believer in drawing your motifs so that it, again, works on that muscle memory in your brain and in your hands so that when you go to quilt something, it feels a lot more second nature. But it also takes so much of the stress out of the actual quilting process, and I find it really fun and exciting now that it's something I've done a bit, that I get really hyped up because I begin to see the finished vision of the quilt, and I get more excited for that quilting process because I know where I'm headed, right? It's like if you're planning a vacation and your plan is like, oh, we're just gonna go on a vacation, and someone says, well, where are you going? I don't know, I think we're just gonna get in the car and I'm sure we'll end up somewhere cool. Well, you might end up somewhere cool, or you might, like, end up broken down in the middle of nowhere because you didn't know there wasn't a gas station, right? Whereas if you make a plan for your trip and someone says, where are you going on vacation? You're like, we're going to Yellowstone. We're going to be there for 10 days. Then we're going to spend, like, an extra 2 days in the Grand Tetons, and these are the hikes we're going to do, and we're going to go on this nature trail, and I can't wait to hear this lecture about the repopulation of wolves in Yellowstone National Park, right? Like, you get all hyped up because you can already see the vision. And sometimes the anticipation ends up being, you know, almost as good as the vacation itself, right? And that's what this does. Like, this is the planning the trip to Yellowstone, okay? Versus thinking you're going to kind of wander off out west somewhere and it'll probably end up fine, all right? All right, my dears, I could talk and talk, but I'm going to let you go because I don't want to overwhelm you with this. I hope you'll spend some time enjoying those blog posts that I've written for you guys. There's more pictures in there. I'd be delighted to answer questions if they come up later. And again, if this has gotten you excited and helped you begin to realize that you can be an amazing free motion quilter, you can be a quilting rock star, I hope you'll put your name down on the waiting list for Free Motion Quilting Academy. It'll be opening up next month and run through this fall, and I'm really excited to see all that y'all learn, the beautiful quilts that you create, and to have the joy of playing a small part in that journey. Thanks so much for joining me tonight, and I'll see you guys soon.